Let's speak to Joel Day in Washington, D.C. now. He's professor at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell Center for Terrorism and Security Studies. Thanks for joining us. What have you made of how the French have responded to the attacks?
Well, clearly they've been highly effective. I think that the French counterterrorism is one of the most effective in the world. And our allies in NATO and around the world need to take them as a model for tackling terrorism within their own countries. We need to remember that ISIS has 40 affiliates around the world, from Malaysia all the way to Mali. What we need to do, along with our French and EU allies, is engage with our allies and give them the sorts of policing tools that have been effective in Paris.
When you talk about the policing tools, clearly they messed up before the attack, when a lot of these individuals were on lists and they were not picked up. Where do you lay the blame?
Well, I think Monday morning quarterbacking is not what anybody wants to do. There are breakdowns in communication, and perhaps they could have done a better job. But after the initial attacks, they've done a very good job mobilizing, fixing whatever holes were there. And I think that the raids today really indicate the direction that they need to go.
Looking at the death of Abaaoud, how significant do you think it is?
I think Abaaoud is one out of a cog of many, right? He can be easily replaced by ISIS Central. They can send another person into Paris or activate cells around the European Union. What I'm particularly interested in, and what I research at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell, is that there are 40 groups who have pledged allegiance to ISIS all across the world, and they have a far more complex hierarchy and a far more complex capacity than this cell did in Paris. And we're talking not just 12 people or 8 people, we're talking hundreds of people, in fact, thousands. And so what we need to really consider is that before the United States, Paris, and the rest of the world attack in ISIS Central, in Raqqa and in Mosul, we need to really consider attacking those groups and doing policing action against those groups from Malaysia to Mali, and make sure that they're tamped down, because what they want to do is replicate what we saw in Paris.
But I mean, how do we know the difference between ideological connective tissue and operational connective tissue? Won't it just become a game of whack-a-mole where you take out certain cells over here and they pop up elsewhere?
Well, that's the challenge. With ISIS, unlike Al-Qaeda, what we recognize is that people are pledging allegiance to ISIS out of a kind of imaginative ideological connection. But what we recognize from the data is that they are replicating ISIS attacks. So groups that used to target military installations, such as the Wilayat Sinai organization, they used to attack police stations and military installations, and then they started transitioning after they endorsed ISIS last year, transitioning to killing Christians, crucifying Christians, cutting off people's heads, and of course now the famous bombing. What we need to recognize is that this Paris attack has now become possibly a model that others across the world can use. Even though they may not be materially connected to ISIS, they may be ideologically connected and try to replicate what we saw in Paris.
How to stop the spread of the ideology? Do you just pull the plug on the internet?
Well, I think that they could find ways around that, including satellite connections, satellite phones, and that is the exact sort of win that ISIS wants to begin with. They want to attack institutions of the West and institutions of freedom, and what we need to do is not pull the plug, because then we can't track them, right? I think that taking them offline completely is dangerous, because then they go to encrypted and dark shadows of the internet, and we can't track what they're doing to create more recruits.
Joel Day, thanks ever so much for joining us. Joel Day joining us there from Washington, D.C.